Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's debate. My name is James Burgess, and I am the chairman, and Nilesh Jetwal is the timekeeper. The adjudicator is Miss Banfeld. The topic of this debate is that Turnbull should stay in Parliament until the next election. The affirmative team, seated to my right, is from Pulteney Grammar School. The negative team, seated to my left, is from ASMS. The speaking time for this debate is 6 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, in which case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please ensure that your mobile phones and other electronic devices are switched off. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, James Lance.
On Tuesday the 28th of August, the Minister for Home Affairs, Peter Dutton, challenged Malcolm Turnbull for the role of Prime Minister and failed. Several ministers offered their resignations. However, Turnbull insisted all ministers remain in Parliament. 2 days later, the party began to break down. Minister Christopher Pyne moved a motion to adjourn question time early, which was upheld. That Friday, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was ousted in a second vote, 45 to 40, yielding his position to Scott Morrison. The former Prime Minister resigned from Parliament 1 week later. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, the topic for tonight's debate is that Turnbull should stay in Parliament until the next election. Now, obviously Mr. Turnbull has already resigned from Parliament, but we will be arguing why he should not have done this. On to our definitions. When referring to Turnbull, the topic is clearly referring to Mr. Malcolm Turnbull, who up until recently was the Prime Minister of Australia. When we talk about staying in Parliament, we do not mean remaining in the seat of Prime Minister. That's neither here nor there. We are referring specifically to the seat of Wentworth in the House of Representatives. We would also like to highlight that the topic states until the next election. It is not suggesting that Turnbull should have stayed in his position forever, simply that he do so until the next federal election, of which there are 2 currently scheduled. The next half-Senate election is set to take place on the 18th of May, 2019, and the next House of Representatives election is scheduled for the 2nd of November of the same year. These dates are subject to change, and likely will, considering recent events. Tonight I, the first speaker, will be talking about the financial costs that would be incurred as a result of Turnbull's resignation. The second speaker will be explaining to you how destabilising Turnbull's sudden absence would be for the government, and the ethics behind such a decision. Our third speaker will be rebutting the team opposite's points and summarising our case. On to my first point. Turnbull quitting Parliament results in a by-election for the seat of Wentworth. By-elections are elections to fill seats that have suddenly been vacated. As it stood before the political unrest that erupted recently, the Liberals had a 1-seat majority in the House of Representatives. Were the Liberals to lose this by-election, and were Labour to get in, the result would be a hung Parliament, which would put the government in a precarious position. The Labour Party has refused to grant the Liberal Party a pair in the by-election. Pairing is a parliamentary convention whereby a member of Parliament agrees to miss a vote where a member from the opposing side cannot attend, due to circumstances such as illness. But as Turnbull is not ill but resigned, Labour has deigned not to grant a pair, which essentially puts the government in a hung position before the vote is even decided. Now, why does this affect you? For one thing, the Liberals losing the Wentworth by-election will more than likely force an early general election. As I stated before, that is currently not slated until late next year. These elections come at a cost to you, Australian taxpayers. According to the Australian Electoral Commission, or the AEC, a by-election costs over $1 million. In 2015, a by-election for the seat in North Sydney, a seat similar to the Wentworth seat, cost $100,739,796. Keep in mind, this is a cost that would be completely unnecessary were Turnbull simply to stay put in Parliament for a few more months. And the general election is a whole different ballpark. The last general election cost almost $200 million of taxpayers' money. Stop and think for a moment about what else that money could be used for. According to the Grattan Institute, a primary school in Australia costs about $100 $15 million to create. Using the money that would otherwise go into elections and by-elections and whatnot, we could build more schools, or roads, or hospitals. Of course, elections are an essential part of our democracy and worth the cost they take to run. We don't dispute that. Our issue is with all the unnecessary time and money that would be wasted trying to work out who's in charge now that Turnbull has resigned from Parliament. For Turnbull just to sit tight for a few more months until the next election rolls around on its own, then Parliament could go on discussing the issues that really matter. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, Malcolm Turnbull resigning from Parliament before the next election causes a huge waste of your money. It creates a whole lot of needless elections and by-elections and uses millions of dollars that could be going to essential infrastructure to do so. Thank you.
I now call upon the first negative speaker, William Morrow.
First of all, we would like to make it clear that the tense of this topic has now changed. It has changed from that Turnbull should stay in Parliament until the next election to that Turnbull should have stayed in Parliament until the next election. Other than that, we mostly agree with we do agree with the opposition's definition. We believe that the reason why he should stay in this seat is for the good of the country, and he has the choice to leave as he doesn't want to be there. This is because our arguments discuss the legality of his decision and how it affects our country. I, the first speaker, will be talking about how he can be more influential outside of the Parliament and how he has no legal obligation to stay in Parliament. Second speaker will be talking about the stability of the government, and the third speaker will rebut and sum our case. So first of all, to start off, the affirmative first speaker stated that $2 million will be wasted on a by-election. However, as I will discuss later, the positives of Malcolm Turnbull leaving Parliament, the benefits outweigh the negatives of this decision, which I'll talk about later. Malcolm Turnbull has little to no influential power on the backbench. We acknowledge that the backbench has roles in the community, but how would have Wentworth felt if their preferred candidate for their electorate by nearly 17% were to be put on the backbench with little influential power? If Malcolm Turnbull became a local leader, he could continue to influence Australian politics positively. For example, in 2018, 403,100 more Australians found employment at the rate of more than 1,000 new jobs a day. This is the highest in Australian history, which is arguably thanks to Malcolm Turnbull's politics. Another example of positively influencing Australia is with the introduction of better immunisations, including successful implementation of the no jab, no pay policy, which immunised an extra 210,000 children in the first year. Another key view that Malcolm Turnbull supports, that is believed by the majority of credible scientists, is climate change, which some of the Liberal Party do not agree with. So these politics and views could be expanded upon if he left Parliament to continue with these positive changes. The reason why he cannot continue these views in Parliament is because how he's been outvoiced by the Liberal Party while being Prime Minister, so he will likely carry even less influential power on the backbench. Evidence to support him getting outvoiced by the Liberal Party is when Tony Abbott heard the idea of an energy policy to combat climate change by Malcolm Turnbull. He threatened to cross the floor, which means change parties and join the opposition, which can start a new leadership, which made Malcolm Turnbull revise his energy plans, which would cost way more money than a single by-election. This shows that even when Malcolm Turnbull was the leader of the Liberal Party, he was still undermined by other members of the party. Also, Malcolm Turnbull has no obligation to keep his seat. This is confirmed by how he had the choice to leave Parliament and did so. And there are no legalities that state that you can be forced to continue being in Parliament. As stated by the Parliament of Australia in a research paper titled Politician Overboard, the pledge to a party is not legally binding. meaning Malcolm Turnbull has no legal obligation to stay in the Liberal Party. You may think he has a moral obligation to stay in the Liberal Party. However, because how he has been previously undermined by members of the party, even when he was head of it, we do not think he has any obligation to stay. You may also think that he has a moral obligation to Australia. However, as discussed, we think he can make better changes to Australia outside of Parliament. So overall, we fully support Malcolm Turnbull's decision to leave Parliament, as he can be a more influential leader outside of Parliament. He had the right to decide to leave, and he would have less influence on topics that he is passionate about on the backbench and topics that affect Australia. And this is compared to the already on the backbench, there's even less power than being Prime Minister, and he was even previously undermined when Prime Minister. Thank you for listening.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Jack Buenfeld.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. As you are aware, we have been debating on the notion that Malcolm Turnbull should have stayed in Parliament until the next election. We as the affirmative team strongly agree with this statement, our first speaker having already displayed why his resignation would be an expensive process for the government and taxpayers. Tonight I will argue why Turnbull leaving the Parliament is a bad example for Australia's democracy, breaching previously set ethical and moral codes, and also how the Liberal Party will not gain anything from the resignation. Quite the opposite. In conjunction with our team's case, our third speaker will be rebutting the opposing team's argument, while also concluding our team's case. But before I proceed with my argument, I would like to point out some of the flaws in the first negative speaker's argument. The first negative speaker has raised concern with our tense change of tonight's topic. We would like to persist with the tense change as we find it appropriate, seeing that Malcolm Turnbull has now in fact left Parliament. However, we don't see how this affects the debate too much. Moving on. Turnbull has decided to leave Parliament due to personal beliefs, stating, and I quote, "I have a strong view which former Prime Ministers are best out of Parliament, not in it," according to the Sydney Morning Herald. Turnbull believes that it is the right thing to do to leave Parliament so that the new Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, can govern without a previous one's interference. However, there is another way to look at this. Turnbull doesn't need to leave Parliament at all. He can choose to stay and represent the people who elected him in Wentworth and support to the party. When Mr. Turnbull ran for the election, he was representing himself to the Wentworth community as an individual who would serve the government for the duration of the term. Therefore, the voters had every right to expect that Mr. Turnbull would be the person to tackle their issues and see out his full term. As a result of Turnbull's leaving Parliament, now for the first time since World War II, the Liberal Party's victory in terms of retaining the seat of Wentworth is not guaranteed. A by-election for Mr. Turnbull's seat will most likely take place in October, according to the ABC. If the government loses the seat, Mr. Morrison will be forced to rely on independents to pass the legislation in a 150-member parliament, making effective decisions a difficult and complex process. If he is able to find the support of the independents, if he is not able to find the support of the independents, he will find himself in a precarious position, having to set call on an early federal election. Scott Morrison has not been given enough time to prove himself as a reliable Prime Minister. Turnbull's resignation will therefore not in fact support Morrison at all, contradicting what he intended to do by resigning. His resignation has also possibly lost the Wentworth seat and the next election for the Liberal Party. Malcolm Turnbull's resignation as Prime Minister also represents the break of yet another oath, but this time from former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. According to the Sydney Morning Herald, following the 2015 leadership spill, Tony Abbott pledged not to undermine Malcolm Turnbull, stating, "There will be no wrecking, no undermining and no sniping." This is relevant as Abbott has been a key player in the 2018 leadership spill, as a well-known critic of Turnbull's National Energy Guarantee, arguably what lost Malcolm Turnbull the position of PM. Abbott dishonouring his own pledge further highlights the moral dilemmas present in the leadership spill, as well as Turnbull's resignation. Turnbull having been forced into an intense situation with little notice. Should Malcolm Turnbull have spat the dummy? The answer is no. Malcolm Turnbull resigning after the pressure put on him during the leadership spill week is an example of imperious individuals getting their way through means of harassment. Alongside this, as you may have heard, the Minister for Women, Kelly O'Dwyer, has reported that many MPs during the spill were bullied. This is further reason why Malcolm Turnbull should have waited to resign until the next election. The fact that our own government has prioritised fighting amongst each other rather than running the country is outrageous. In a further twist, Mr Abbott's sister-in-law, Christine Foster, had been reported to be considering running for the Wentworth seat, only choosing to step down this Monday, according to SBS, based on her not wanting to bring negative attention to herself. Many media personalities already theorising that her election was a planned proxy for division within the Liberal Party. Although she has not now stepped down as a candidate, the fact that she, alongside her Liberal supporters, had even begun to flirt with the idea of running for the Wentworth seat is morally bankrupt, something that Mrs Foster now agrees with, evident by her stepping down. Tony Abbott's involvement in the election spill seems more or less revenge-orientated, leading me to sometimes forget if these gentlemen are playing politics or play school. The resignation of Malcolm Turnbull should have never come to arise, his resignation proving to be a bigger loss for the Liberal Party as a result of the seat of Wentworth and the next election now heavily in the favour of Labour. The leadership spill and subsequently Turnbull leaving Parliament represents a poor effort of democracy. Malcolm Turnbull alternatively should have moved to the backbench in order to honour the unspoken contractual agreement with those who voted for him into power. Thank you.
I now call upon the second negative speaker, Chris Johnson.
Power actually.
Sorry.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for today's debate is that Turnbull should have stayed in Parliament until the next election. We, the negative team, believe this statement to be false. To rebut, the first affirmative speaker has said that the by-election would be expensive and that Turnbull should stay. Therefore, Turnbull should stay. Well, yes, the by-election would be expensive. It would be $2 million. But for the benefit of the country, it's a small price to pay. The government has sanctioned $1 to $10 million to each public school this year, which is a lot of money, but it's for a good cause, to improve education. And here we're discussing the future of the country. And on the grand scale, $2 million is not a large amount of money. Okay. The second affirmative speaker has stated that Liberal will lose the Wentworth by-election, and which they have had for a lot of years. Well, yes, it is possible that Liberal would lose the Wentworth by-election, but it doesn't matter who wins or stays in power and who doesn't. As long as the people want the winning party in power, that's all that matters. So, to recapitulate, our first speaker has stated that Turnbull being suppressed by his party means that he cannot be as influential by staying in Parliament, and that he has no obligations to keep his seat and has legal rights to renounce it. Today, I will be talking about why Turnbull's decision to stay can bring instability to the government. Now, on to my point. Well, first of all, why is the stability of the government important? Well, since Prime Minister John Howard, who lost office in 2007, 5 Prime Ministers have been in office. 1 even served twice, but none have served a full term. If Prime Ministers can't even stay in office for a substantial amount of time, how are they supposed to do anything significant for the country? With every Prime Minister comes a new ideology, and with that comes new policies. Every policy doesn't satisfy everyone, but keeping them consistent for a while surely helps. For example, businesses need to know the policies are going to be stable so that they can make plans and decisions for the future. They obviously care about the actual policies themselves, but the uncertainty of them remaining or not is what they dislike. So how can Turnbull's decision to stay in Parliament affect the stability of the government? Well, for that we can look at Tony Abbott's case, who also lost leadership, but chose to stay in Parliament instead of leaving. He's been accused of undermining the policies of the Liberal government and Malcolm Turnbull, which the media has termed sniping. So Abbott has made comments such as, well, idiocy is doing more of the same and expecting a different result, which, by the way, is a misquoting of Einstein's famous insanity quote. He has also said, we have massively increased renewables, and what have we got? We have a doubling of price, we've got blackouts, and we're rationing our routine. If you want to increase renewables even more, that is to say unreliable power, from the current 17% to 36%, we are going to get more of the same. Both of these quotes are referring to Turnbull's proposal for the National Energy Guarantee. So we can infer Abbott's opinions about Turnbull just by the tone of these two comments. Although just after losing leadership, he did say that there will be no wrecking, no undermining, and no sniping. I've never leaped or backgrounded against anyone, and I certainly won't start now. But then he did exactly that. But no two minds are alike, unless they're clones, of course, but that's not the case here. Well then, wouldn't it be an assumption that Turnbull would be the same as Abbott? Well yes, no two minds are alike, which also means that they probably won't agree on everything. Abbott swore he wouldn't undermine the Prime Minister, but he eventually did. Turnbull may have thought that if he stayed in Parliament, he's probably not going to agree with many of the policies or actions that the new Prime Minister takes. And he may have not wanted to snipe Morrison, but just by speaking his mind, he could potentially undermine him, slowly decreasing the party's support for Morrison, like he's experienced firsthand by the presence of Tony Abbott in the backseat. So Turnbull had a choice of staying and bringing stability to the Parliament, like Abbott, or leaving for the benefit of the country. Even knowing he could have sniped Morrison and became Prime Minister again, like Kevin Rudd, as he had only lost leadership by a small margin, he chose to leave Parliament for the stability of the government and consequently the benefit of the people. So, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, Turnbull should have left Parliament, as that will assist in keeping the government stable, which is ultimately in favour of the people. Thank you.
I now call upon the third affirmative speaker, William Rook.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. As you have heard, tonight we've discussed a topic that former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull should stay in Parliament until the next election. As our first speaker highlighted, we take this topic in three parts: that Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister, should stay in Parliament, not necessarily as Prime Minister, and until the next election. This would not only save resources, which could be put to better use, but would support the smooth running of our democracy, which has admittedly suffered in recent years. Before I go on to summarise our team case, I'll firstly address some of the concerns that the speakers opposite have raised. To begin with, the opposition's first speaker stated that Malcolm Turnbull now has little to no power as he is not Prime Minister anymore and serves on the backbench. And also stated that Wentworth will be let down because he won't be able to have as much of a say now. However, we see this as outside the scope of the topic. The topic isn't whether it's good for him to be out of Prime Minister or whether he should have more influence. It's whether or not he should stay in Parliament. And as a backbencher, we would argue that he does indeed have more power than if he was not involved in politics whatsoever. The opposition also stated that he could have a community influence and this would be good for the Wentworth community. However, he can still have this influence if he remains in Parliament. And further, as a representative, which Wentworth, the electorate, has elected, it's his responsibility to be a community influence and to take these influential ideas to the party which he's part of. Further, they stated that Turnbull has brought about a lot of positive change throughout his leadership career, citing the example of vaccinations. And we agree with this completely. And if anything, it's good reason for him to stay in politics and to remain an influential person who can bring about change in the Liberal Party. This is the same as for the opposition's statement that the Liberals disagree with climate change. Why should we get rid of all support for climate change from the Liberal Party for the sake of supporting climate change? It doesn't add up. Further, they stated that the threat of Tony Abbott or Malcolm Turnbull crossing the floor would change the leadership and cause a government change. However, the opposition is mistaken in their understanding of crossing the floor. Crossing the floor is simply changing which side you support for a vote. However, it does not change which party you are part of, and therefore will not change government. Further, the first speaker stated that Malcolm Turnbull has no obligation to leave. While this may be true, although our previous points have shown otherwise, there is no reason for him to leave just because he has no obligation to stay. If he leaves, there is a possible multiple $1 million cost to the taxpayers. Not to mention that he will be giving in to bullying within his party, as our previous speakers have stated. On to the opposition's second speaker, they stated that $2 million put in an election is good because it's for the betterment of the country, and compare this to the $1.2 million which the party has used to fund schools. However, this is not a fair comparison. Firstly, we'd like to highlight that we did not state the by-election would cost $2 million. We stated that it would likely cost over $1 million. Secondly, the party, by Malcolm Turnbull leaving the party, this would bring about a great cost which could be simply mitigated. Costs going to schools bring about change, and they're not costs that you could make cheaper by any means. They have to be paid to schools. However, if Malcolm Turnbull simply stays in Parliament until the next election, as said in the topic, this cost could be completely mitigated, and any supposedly beneficial effects of him leaving Parliament would still come about. Further, the second speaker stated that whoever wins the Wentworth seat in the by-election wouldn't matter, as long as the people are happy and democracy is working in Australia. However, by the Wentworth seat being won by anyone other than Liberals, the government will no longer hold a majority in the House of Representatives. This is hugely detrimental to our democracy, as the party can no longer function and pass legislation. On to our team summary. Our first speaker spoke about the political background of this topic and the economic benefits of keeping Mr Turnbull in Parliament until the next election. The departure of the former PM could trigger an unnecessary by-election which would cost over $1 million taxpayer dollars, which could be going to more important services. Our second speaker stressed the extent to which Malcolm Turnbull leaving Parliament could detriment our democracy. Without Turnbull's seat in the House of Representatives, the Liberal Party no longer holds majority. If this seat was won by Labor, the gap between the parties would narrow, impeding the flow of legislation and leading to further quarrelling. Further, the people of Wentworth, who democratically elected Mr Turnbull, will be left disillusioned after he fails to fulfil his responsibilities. For that reason, Mr Chair, ladies and gentlemen, Malcolm Turnbull should stay in Parliament until the next election. This saves costs on a by-election which could be spent in better places and maintains the integrity of our democracy we strive to uphold. It is Mr Turnbull's duty to respect Wentworth and stay for his elected term. There should be no question about it. Malcolm Turnbull must stay in Parliament until the next election. Thank you.
I now call upon the third negative speaker, Chris Johnson.
Good evening, Madam Chairman. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that Turnbull should have stayed in Parliament until the next election. We, the negative team, disagree on this topic. Now on to my rebuttals. The first affirmative speaker has said that Turnbull can just sit tight and wait out till the next election in order to prevent the result of a hung Parliament. You see, even when Turnbull and the Liberal Party had a majority in the Parliament, he still found it a struggle to pass policies such as a national energy guarantee. Now, as our first negative speaker has said, Mr. Turnbull has been ridiculed and undermined by members of his own party, such as Tony Abbott, numerous times, specifically about the national energy guarantee. In order to appease these people, he had to reform many of his policies and get rid of targets such as a climate change target in the national energy guarantee, which was the original goal of that policy. It was to reduce our impact on climate change. Because these people disagreed and threatened to choose the opposing side, meaning that this policy would not go through at all, he had to make sure that this policy would go through because it made such a huge impact on Australians. He chose to completely eradicate that whole target, which was tackling climate change, which was the initial goal of the target. This shows how little power he initially had, even when he was Prime Minister, which is much higher position than what he would have if he had remained in Parliament. If he had remained in Parliament, he would have remained as a backbencher, which, considering the fact that even as PM, one of the highest positions that a person can hold in Parliament, he was continuously ridiculed by the opposition party and members of his own party. Being a backbencher would give him to close to nothing to little influence over topics being discussed, and would give him limited opportunities to discuss topics that he's passionate about, such as climate change. The second affirmative speaker has said that Malcolm Turnbull should stay until the election, although him and other ministers in the party were being harassed and ridiculed and undermined during this whole leadership spill. Now, my one question is, would you let a victim of bullying and harassment remain in the same environment as their bully? Because, you should suck it up. It is your obligation to remain in there. No, we wouldn't, because that's not the moral thing to do. You don't let a person who's going through that pain remain in the same place where the source of pain is. The morally right thing to do, or the humane thing to do, is to let him leave and escape from this source of negativity in his life. Furthermore, he has said that the consideration of Tony Abbott's sister as a new candidate in Turnbull's place was the suspected goal of the leadership spill. This is a prime example of the disorder in the Liberal Party. And so some of the Liberal Party, or at least most of the Liberal Party, is dissatisfied with Malcolm Turnbull and his forward-thinking ideas. They simply wanted him to leave the position as PM. If this is the case, as I pointed out before, Malcolm Turnbull would again have little to no influence over his party and the community while remaining in the seat of Wentworth in the Parliament, if he were to remain. Remaining would be disastrous for his personal benefit and the benefit of the country, as the harassment and bullying and ridicule would still continue. There wouldn't be a stop to it. He would still be at the same place. Like, imagine going to your workplace and having to face that. That is what he would have to go through every day. The third affirmative has said that if he stays, that he will have some influence. Again, as I said before, the whole reason for the electorate of Wentworth voting for him as their representative is so that he can go into Parliament and talk about issues that they face and bring these issues to light and actually have an influence over the community, over the party. As a backbencher, he will not be given a valuable position, considering as even as PM he wasn't really, he didn't have the support of the party. He has also said that Turnbull leaving will cause all the support for climate change to be lost. As I pointed out before, he could not get the climate change policy to pass because people in his own party did not support him. And the Labour Party and nearly no one in the Labour Party supported him at all. So him leaving really isn't changing much to the support of climate change, because overall the government does not support tackling climate change, as pointed out by the National Energy Guarantee. The third speaker has also committed a strawman fallacy. He has said that the second speaker stated that we only care about direct democracy and people being happy, which is not true. Our second speaker said that democracy does not necessarily mean good or more things are needed. We did not look at direct democracy, and it wasn't just democracy itself being the factor considered. We were also talking about different things that are needed for a country than a disorganized Liberal Party. To conclude, our first speaker has okay. The first negative speaker has explained that Malcolm Turnbull should have stayed in Parliament because he really has no legal obligation to stay. The Australian Parliament states that the pledge to a party is not legally binding. He has also said that cutting ties with the party will mean that Turnbull will have a greater influence on the community than remaining in the backbench. In addition to this, Turnbull receives constant backlash from members of his party when putting forth policies. Therefore, removing himself from this party will mean that he can have a greater influence.